Okay, it is now 1 o'clock. So with us today, talking about the legal aspects of millages is Ann Suring, who most of you know is an attorney with Foster Swift, Collins and Smith. And I'm going to leave it to Ann. Thank you very much, Ann, for being here.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you on millages. I'm looking at a list of millages that I'm doing for the August ballots. I know there's a lot of you out there that are thinking about a millage this year, either in August or in December. So um, one of the things that is really important to understand is the legalities of it. And I have conversations these days on a weekly basis with clients about some of these very same issues. So something to consider when you are considering going for a millage. The first thing I like to cover is authority. What authority does the library have to request or levy a millage? And the good news is libraries have authority to levy millages, almost all of them except the ones that are, and Claire, I don't know how many are left, but 267 libraries that are have no statute governing them anymore. But most of you, I think, will be in one of these 4 categories here. So just some things to consider. Section 13 of the District Library Establishment Act provides the authority for district libraries to levy a millage. And actually, district libraries have a lot of, I think, extra things that they can do that other types of public bodies and even other libraries don't have. And one of them is to levy up to 4 mills, which is actually quite a bit of millage. Um, I think most district libraries don't levy that high, but if you need it, you can. Of those 4 mills, 2 can be in perpetuity, and the other 2 mills must be not levied for more than 20 years. Um, District libraries, and I just want to pause a minute. District libraries have some issues, different issues too than other types of libraries. Um, District libraries can be funded in a few different ways. One of them is through general fund contributions from their participating municipalities. The second way is through millages that each of the participating municipalities might individually approve and ask voters. And the third, which is the most common, is a district-wide millage. And what's really important for libraries to understand is that the district-wide millage has to be levied uniformly throughout the district. This becomes important, as I note here in the slide. If you have a municipality that joins the district after the initial establishment, they have to approve the library's millage that's in effect. So this is important too, because some of you might think you have district-wide millages, but you actually have millages that are levied individually by your individual participating municipalities. So keep in mind when you are looking at millages. It's really important. I think one of the messages today is to I always give homework at this presentation, and it's to go back and look at your current millage proposals and make sure that you understand when the millage ends, who's levying the millage as a district-wide millage, so that you make sure that you don't miss deadlines or don't miss opportunities. The other unique thing about a district library that is really important, and I have a slide later in this, but I want to make sure that when you're planning on millages, if you have a city that's a part of your district, make sure that you know when they can levy their millages. Most district libraries levy their millages, I think, in December, district-wide. But some municipalities, some cities by charter only have summer levies. And so you have to levy the same millage rate uniformly in the district in any calendar year. So if you're going for a renewal, for example, in August, and you have a city that has to levy in July, you've already missed the opportunity for that city to levy in this calendar year, and your first year will have to be the next year. So if that's confusing, certainly something you should talk to your lawyer about. But your L40, everyone should also access their L4029s. And Claire, I don't know if you can throw up that link.
Yep,
It,
I will.
yeah, if you have to see it, like you can tell from your L4029s whether you levy in July or whether you levy in December, and so that's really important to know too. The district library board itself has the authority to levy the or to ask voters for the millage. We recommend you adopt it by resolution. It does not need approval from your participating municipalities, and should not go to your participating municipalities for approval. All right, section 10 and 10A, PA 164 libraries. Cities are, if you're a PA 164 library, it's an 1877 statute. It's not very well defined. And there are really two types of libraries within the PA 164. And I'm going to talk about the first one, is a section 10 or 10A PA 164 library. You know that you're a 10 or 10A if you're established properly, which isn't always the case, but you know you're a 10 or 10A if you have an elected board. Section 1, which we'll get to in a minute, has an appointed board. So if there's one of the other homework, and Claire's always been excellent about figuring this out, that if you don't know who you are, don't know what you are, then certainly talk to Claire and she can assist with figuring out what type of library you are. But these are initially established by petition, and the petition had to ask for a vote. This, like I said, this is an 1877 statute, so it may be that your petition in your first election was, 100 years ago. So sometimes we don't always know exactly, but we can really tell sometimes from how you've been acting over the past couple decades, for example. The tax, a PA section 10 or 10A library can ask for up to 2 mills, and it could be in perpetuity or for a number of years too. When this millage is collected, just like other township and city taxes or village, depending on what kind of library you are, and then it's put into the library fund. The advantage of this is if you're established as a section 10 or 10A PA 164 library, it's a strange relationship, I think, with the township or city or village to which you're affiliated. The library board has exclusive authority after you're established to determine whether you're going to go for a new millage, a renewal, an increase, and even over the objection, let's say, of the city, township, or village. But the strange part is that your ballot language will say, or will look like, for district libraries, it says, shall the district library levy the millage? Here, it will say, shall the village, shall the township, or the city levy the millage on behalf or for library purposes. So this might be something to think about with your municipality. Probably 10 years ago, I would have said, look, just have the city or township or village also sort of rubber stamp and pass a resolution to approve this ballot language as well. We were having a little bit of trouble at times with county clerks who wouldn't understand that it says village or township or city millage, but it's actually not the city that's required, or the village or the township, to put the ballot on, or to approve the ballot for to go in front of voters. And so sometimes as a belt and suspender approach, we also had the township, the city or village approve the language. Sometimes we still do that, but we want to make sure that they understand that they don't have a say in whether it goes on or how much, that they're really, it's a ministerial effort on their behalf to put the ballot language on. Check the chat a minute, make sure. Okay. So that's PA1, section 10 or 10A libraries. Section 1 libraries are also under PA 164. They are only city libraries. There's only a city can have a PA 164 library. What's amazing about this type of library that is so unusual in Michigan law is that a section 1 city library can levy up to 1 mil without a vote. There's a long constitutional reason to that. There was a constitutional amendment that took place years and years ago that said that any new millage is required a vote and we're limited by 20 years. But they carved out and they grandfathered any statute that was in existence at the time of this constitutional amendment, and this is one of them. So you can ask for 1 mil without a vote of the public. You can ask for a second mil with a vote of the public. This, unlike a section 10 or 10A, is entirely within the discretion of the city council. The city council can determine how much to levy within that 1 mill every year and whether to go for voters for the second mill. And if the second mill is how much to levy each year for the second mill. So there's a give and take, I think, as far as authority goes here. It's good. It's a great way to set up a city library even without a vote. The negative effect is that you're really at the mercy of the city with respect to how much you can levy each year. And we have seen situations where cities have said, I want to share, or, we feel like our taxpayers have too much of a burden, so we're not going to levy the full amount of the library millage. Unfortunately, that does happen sometimes. And here it's one of those things that you really have to start to think about if you start to have issues with your city on this subject. Sometimes cities, libraries decide to convert to PA 164 or 10A libraries. And so that's one of the options too, or form a district because of the lack of the autonomy on the ability to levy millages. So let's see. So this one's not within the discretion of the board. County libraries, your statute's a little bit vague. Most county libraries, you have the county they have the authority to levy a millage in support of the county library. If you are a county library and have any questions about your authority, I would ask that you talk to your lawyer. The statute, I put it right here, it's an old statute. Again, it's not as old as PA 164. I think it's, 1917 or something like that. It's old too, and it's not very user friendly. So this is something that if you're a county library and have issues with funding, talk to your attorney. So now that we've talked about authority, how much do you ask for? This is something that, I think more and more libraries are becoming dependent on their millages rather than state aid and penal fines. Penal fines is something that I think has really, gone down, especially during COVID when they weren't stopping trucks as much as they used to. The penal fines have really, I think, been taking a big hit as far as a funding source from municipalities. I do recommend that you think about any endowments that you have or any large gifts that you have. Because if you're sitting on a couple $1 million in an endowment and they're going for a new additional millage, it might not go over very well. So these are things that you can talk with Shirley when we meet again next in the next part of the series. Talk about the way you kind of market the millage. But I know this is one thing to really think about. And what other money, what sources of revenue do you have coming in? I've mentioned a few here, but that all impacts on how much you ask for as far as millage. Other factors are voters approving other millages. This is sort of a when to go and how much to ask. One of the things that's hard to determine is whether there's going to be a lot of millages on any particular ballot, and taxpayers might say, oh, they're asking for roads and ambulance and libraries, and so they get to be kind of picky and choosy as far as which millages go. I think, and anecdotally, it's just purely anecdotally, I see library millages passing probably at a greater rate than other types of millages, except for maybe police and fire. But I think I've been really pleasantly surprised over the last couple, decades and election cycles that library millages still seem to pass pretty, and seen a nod from Claire too. So that makes me think that, that's a good thing. But did your last millage pass by a significant margin? Again, do you anticipate heavy rollbacks? Are you getting your millage rollback significantly every year because of increased property values? It might dictate what your starting point is for your millage rate. And do you have long-term plans for the funds? Some libraries are not going for full faith and credit bonds these days, which is a voted bond, usually to build a new library or a major capital improvement. And full faith and credit bonds are bonds that you can levy the amount necessary annually in order to pay back the bond. A lot of libraries are actually using voted millages that look like regular millages to do capital projects, so that they'll have a millage, that is intended. It's 1 mil for 20 years, maybe, for example, and the intent is to pay back the bonds. And so depending on the use of the millage, will dictate the amount and how long and some of those other issues, rather than if it's just a general operational type millage. All right, developing ballot language. Ballot language is boring, and it is supposed to be boring. And I don't want the word pressure is not the right word, but I have clients that increasingly want to do explanation or marketing of the ballot in the proposal itself. And I typically don't recommend that. One, if you look at the ballots, and I'm kind of a this is weird, I guess. I like to look at, I'll often research and look at people's ballots because I'm curious to see how millages are presented to voters and, for other types of entities. And typically they're all pretty much the same. And so I think the best place to explain to voters or to do your marketing. And we'll talk a little bit about legal restrictions. I think we can get into with Shirley next time about some of the, practical implications of that. But also because there's an ability to challenge the ballot language if the ballot language is misleading or unclear or deceptive to voters or says something that's just wrong or legally incorrect. And the more you put in the ballot, I guess the more likely you are to have the ballot challenged. There's more opportunity things to challenge if you get it wrong. If you get something wrong in a millage material, it's not as big of a deal as if you get it wrong in the ballot language itself. So that's something to really be considerate of when you talk about what should be in the ballot proposal. But in 1999, sadly, I remember when this came out, it was such a big deal. And communities are now more used to what the requirements are, but there's specific information that must be included in ballot language. And so I'm going to run through all of that because when I draft ballot language, this is what I do. I send in some information out to clients that this is the information I need in order to draft the proposal. So this is the list of things that you should be prepared to answer when considering drafting a ballot proposal. Obviously, the most important is what is the millage rate authorized? It has to be expressed in mils, and 1 mil is 1/10 of a cent. So typically, if your millage is 1 mil, it's 1.0 mil, and then 0.5 mil. And it's singular and plural. Anything over 1 is plural mils. Anything under 1 is singular mils. And we often use in an amount not to exceed, meaning that the libraries can have discretion. I think without even if you said should levy 1 mil. I mean, obviously you could levy less than that. I don't think anyone's going to sue you for levying less than you could levy, but we always make sure, or we try to make sure that it's in an amount not to exceed, just to make sure that there's discretion to levy up to that full amount of the mills. But the millage rate is, I think, the first and most important part. You're also required to provide the estimated amount of revenue that will be collected the first year that is levied. And this seems like an easy thing. Usually you take your taxable value of your L4029 and you multiply it times your millage rate divided by 1,000. There you get your estimated first year of levy. The trick comes in, I think, when you go for a millage early, and let's just say we're facing this now. We have the most recent set of data we have is the L4029, your taxable value from 2023. If you want to levy in 2024, we typically estimate a little bit of an adjustment up. Your county treasurer or maybe your finance department might have an estimate of whether they expect that to increase by 3% or 4%. And so it is just an estimate, but we try to get it as clean as possible and as precise as possible. And so just make sure that if you're using old numbers that you do a little bit of inflation, try to predict a little bit of inflation to get it to the right number depending on what year you're going to actually levy it. It is an estimate, so sometimes I'll see ballot language that'll say, in the first year it's expected to levy, $850,000 $2.21. You know, you don't have to get down that granular. Typically be estimated out and round at some point. But again, this should be pretty easy because I think one of the primary factors in determining what your millage rate is how much money do you expect to, you know, what's your budget and how much money do you expect to raise from that millage. Checking the chat, just make sure. Okay. Okay, the duration of millage in years, and this is kind of tricky, so you have to be kind of careful. I typically use my fingers just because if you're levying, let's just say you're levying this year for 20 years. If you start and levy the first year in 2024, 20 years will actually end up in 2043, not 2044. So again, make sure that you're being very careful about when your duration is so that it's actually only 10 years of actual levy versus 11. Because if you went from, let's just say you went from 2024 to 2034, that's actually an 11-year millage because you count the first year and the last year, and not a 10-year millage. So again, make sure that you have someone review your ballot language pretty closely to make sure that issue is addressed. Some libraries only levy a millage or portion of millage for the maximum of 20 years. So you have to be careful to make sure that you have a limit in there if you're required to have a limit. Other libraries may be limited by charter. If you're a city library that's established by charter, you might have some charter restrictions. So ask your library attorney for some direction on that. So also consider the year that you desire the initial levy, and I'll give you an example of the last, they may be concerned about voter approval of millage renewal of the last levy of the previously authorized millage occurred in December 2023. So sometimes you hold an election in November of 23 and vote for a 10-year millage renewal. Note that the first year, the initial levy will occur in 2023, and the last one will be 2033 in this example. This is one thing to take into account too, is that the library has to submit its millage amount to be levied to the county clerk, your L4029. That's typically due on September 30th of each year, but there's a specific statute that says if a millage is held in November at the general election, you can levy in December of that year. What I typically do is if you're going to do that, is send an email to the county equalization or county treasurer's office to make sure that, you know, that everyone's on the same page that can occur. And this is always an area to, if you're going in November and you want to levy in December, make sure you can levy in December. This goes back to an earlier comment I made about the cities that might levy in the summer. So obviously, if you are going for a November, first year November ballot, if you can levy thoroughly in your district through December, then that's an option. If you can levy some of it in summer, then your first year really should not be December or of that same year. It should be the next year. So that's just something to consider when you're planning ahead with your millages. A clear statement of the purpose of the millage is another thing that has to be included in your ballot language. And this is one that if you have an old ballot proposal, you know, be kind of careful about whether you want to continue with the same wording. And the reason is that some of the older ballot proposals, you know, say for running or operating library, and you can only use your money or that you collect from a millage proposal for the purposes that are stated in the ballot language. I've never seen a challenge on this before, but you know, I think the issue is that if you said, well, it's for the operating the library, I think it begs the question of whether you could use the money for capital improvements for constructing. Again, I wouldn't, you know, lose any sleep over your prior ballot language. Like I said, I think it's something that it's probably more theoretical than actual, but what we do for district libraries, for example, we say for all purposes authorized by law. Um, but sometimes you may actually want to be very specific on how you use the ballot language. And I'll give you some examples. Um, Sometimes you would like to use the money and have voters know that you're using the money for the construction of a new library. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's something that certainly is within your ability to do as a library. But you know, I noted this as an example of a common problem is we want to use the money to operate the new building, but our ballot language says we can only use it for the construction. Can we use the money for the operation? This would likely be subject to challenge. And if you have money that, let's just say you've paid off all the construction costs and you have some money left over, it has to be held in escrow until you can use it for the purposes in your ballot language. So sometimes, if it's for a new building, you want to make voters know that it's for this new building, you can be a little bit broader. And I gave an example here, such as constructing, equipping, and operating the building. Because typically new buildings, larger buildings, they're usually always larger, have increased operational costs. So I think it's pretty natural to have a millage request that encompasses some of that, but just make sure that your voters understand all the purposes for which that ballot language would be used. Another common problem, the voters approved the millage for 10 years to operate the John Doe branch of the Newtown District Library. And now they're considering closing the branch. Can we use the millage for other purposes? Again, it could be subject to challenge. If that's why to be a little bit more encompassing when you feel like you can. And if you choose to be narrow, that should be a very deliberate choice to have a narrow purpose. And I wanted to provide another example of a common problem. We just asked voters for an operating millage last year, but the money is not going to be enough and have to reduce the hours the library is open. We asked for an additional operational millage to increase the hours of operation. The answer is yes, as long as it's still within the authorized amount, but the money may only be for those additional hours to the then current schedule. So again, this is another example. If you want to be specific, you can, but make sure that that narrow purpose is not going to, turn around and be something that you can't live with. So understand that it's for a very specific purpose if that's what you want to do. You have to have a clear statement of whether the proposed millage is a renewal of a previously authorized millage or an authorization of a new additional millage. In my opinion, your ballot language has to say one or both of these. Okay, it has to use the word renewal or has to use the word new additional. I've seen other ballot languages that don't use that, and I've heard some arguments from other people as to just using increase. But this italicized statement is right from the statute, and so I don't risk that by using different words. And to be a renewal, and this is something that it's something that we've had the opinion of for a long time, and we were seeing other communities not agreeing with this opinion. And now I think most communities have come around to this. The Michigan Township Association has published material supporting our interpretation. And that is that in order to be called a renewal, it has to be the amount last levied or that you will last levy and not the original authorized amount. I'll give you an example. If voters authorized a millage of 1 mil years ago, but it's been reduced to 0.87, the renewal must be only 0.87 mil. If you wanted to restore the full millage, you have to ask the voters for a new additional millage of 0.13 mil. So a renewal is only it's the amount that's been reduced by Headley and last levied by Headley, and it's not so you can't ask for, in this example, you can't ask for a renewal of 1 mil. I think that's not in conformance with the statute. So one of the questions is, if you want to have your current building bond millage move to an operational millage in the future, how would you explain that? That's a really good question. I think if what you're talking about is a bond, like a voted bond, a full faith and credit bond, I don't think you can ever state that it is a replacement or it's going to be, superseding that. I think you have to treat those like apples and oranges. Except in your marketing material of the millage, you can remind voters, for example, that let's just say that the millage was a voted bond for 20 years, 1 mil. This is the last year it's getting paid off, and now you want to go and ask the voters for 1 mil for operational purposes. I think with the ballot language, it's going to be very difficult to make any explanation. And I'd have to look at the specific circumstances to be very definite about that. But just as a general matter, I don't think you take care of that issue in the ballot. On the ballot, I think where you take care of that issue is with the marketing material. When you tell voters, hey, we just paid off the bond, so we're not, so this is the amount we're going to be levying, each year. And that's as long as it's factual, you can market the millage that way instead of using the bond or instead of using the ballot language to use that explanation. I think that's a dangerous area when it comes to something like that. And if I didn't answer that question fully, we can certainly talk about it after the presentation, or you can ask another question in the chat. So any millage that's not a renewal. So if you're going for a Headley override, that's new additional millage. If you already have 1 mil in perpetuity and you need another mil, that's also new millage. You don't actually have to indicate whether there's any other millages out there. So let's just say you have 1 mil in perpetuity that you voted in 30 years ago, and it's slowly being chipped away by the Headley Amendment. And so you don't want to do anything. It's a perpetual millage. You don't have to renew it or do anything to it. It still stays there, but you need additional funding. You don't have to tell voters, oh, in your ballot language, this is 1 mil. We're asking for 1 mil. And oh, by the way, we have this other perpetual millage there. It's not a requirement of the millage language itself. The ballot language also has to fully disclose each local unit of government to which revenue from that millage will be dispersed. I've got really good news out of West Branch on this from the library's perspective, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think the library community about, was it 2017 now, was just such a benefit from an amendment to the DDA acts and those types of acts to generally exempt new library millages from capture by certain units of government. And we'll get to this in a minute. But the statute defines a local unit of government as county, village, city, school district, other public library, or local authority. And local authorities did include DVAs. So new millages or renewals that are approved after January 1 will not be captured by the following authorities. And these are the authorities that you're automatically exempt from capture. Okay. What the West Branch case is that the township in that case was arguing that if the library was going for a renewal, that renewal did not trigger this exemption. And the library argued that yes, indeed, it did trigger this exemption because the issue wasn't whether it was a rural or new millage, it was whether it was a millage approved by voters after that date. And long story short, the library was successful. And so now, last year when I gave this presentation, I had a little caveat, there's this case out there, but now if you have a renewal of your millage, either in whole or in part, it's going to be automatically exempt from capture by these particular entities. The one that's still included in the group that's very common are brownfield redevelopment authorities, and they're actually becoming more common. So if you have, if your last millage was in let's just say 2014 or 2013, 10-year millage is coming up, your last millage probably had to indicate that you it was subject to disclosure, that you had the DDA, the LDFAs, tax increment authorities, and brownfields would capture the millages. That same millage now, the only one that you have to report or put on your ballot proposal would be the brownfield redevelopment. Unless the caveat is you can agree to allow some of these entities to capture your millage. And if you currently have that agreement that covers any part of your proposed new millage period, then yes, you're going to have to disclose that on the ballot in your ballot language. I want to give a little piece of advice to libraries about that. I don't, there's all different types of relationships that you as a library have with your local, and there's many libraries that benefit and have a great relationship with the brownfield, with some of these authorities. My advice always is if you can exempt your taxes, exempt them. You can always agree to give them a portion on your terms. But this is more for, other areas of the law that were fixed rather than these new millages, because these new millages are going to be automatically exempt. But if you have an opportunity where you can decide how much and how long you want to give millages and it's on your terms, that I think from a library's perspective, that's always a better position to be in. But here, it's going to be automatically exempt. So if you get any pushback from local municipalities on that, some of them might still be capturing your millage, even if it's not on the ballot. So watch out for that. I think a lot of mistakes have been made since 2017 as to what millages are subject to capture and what aren't. So make sure that you, especially if you're coming up for a new millage, make sure that local municipality understands that this new millage in the renewal of millage cannot be captured by the local DDA, LDFA, or whatever capturing agency. Let's see. One of the things I do also want to bring up that's a common issue with libraries to some extent is that this would also apply to some of your contracted service area. And where it would apply, in my opinion, depends on the terms of the contract. So if you agree to, if you have a reciprocal borrowing agreement, let's say with a neighboring library, and it's for, a set amount, like that your library pays them, $20,000 a year. That's not going to be something you're going to have to report on your ballot. But if you agree to disperse directly millage money to them, if you agree to give them, 0.2 mils of what's collected or the amount collected in millage from within a certain jurisdiction, that's where I see it. When you've got a neighboring library and you guys are both really serving one geographic area, but that library might actually serve it more. So you give that millage money, your district millage money, to that other library as part of your reciprocal bargaining agreement. Those contracts may have to be disclosed. So that's something you should certainly alert your attorney to and talk to them about whether that's a type of contractual arrangement that has to be included on that. But again, are you directly giving millage money versus general fund contributions? And that's going to be an issue. And that might be an issue too to consider when moving forward on drafting agreements. You may not want to give them, millage percentage, because you're going to have to notify voters of that arrangement on the ballot. So again, I think this language was, intended to ensure that voters knew that certain entities could capture a millage. This is where education becomes very important. I think more so for district libraries, I think, than other types of libraries, because if you're a city library and it's a city brownfield, the taxpayers are all the same. Where I see it become an issue is if you're a district library and you have, let's say, 2 townships in a city and the brownfields in the city. Sometimes the township residents don't want their money going to a city brownfield redevelopment. It's actually not the case, even factually, but that might be a little bit of voter education. Again, not so much now, because most of the captures are exempt now, but some of them that are not exempt probably do need a little bit of education. All right. Do you need 1 or 2 questions? And some of this is a strategy issue, and so you might choose to have two questions or one question, but there's a legal impediment, and this actually has come up a lot lately with the millages I've been seeing, so I do want to make sure that you understand this. Um, that section 21124F provides that a taxing unit that levies a millage under this act shall not submit a single question to the electors of a taxing unit requesting both a renewal of the voter authorized millage and authorization of new additional millage if the new additional millage is greater than 0.5 mils. So we're going to get into some examples of how this plays out. And this really comes into play because a lot of libraries, I think it's a good strategy. They, you know, what we talked about before, you can only amount call that the last levy, the amount last levy or renewal. So sometimes they just want to get back up to the original authorized amount. And so part of that will be a renewal and part of that will be a new millage. In this example, our library previously approved 1.5 mils for 20 years. The millage expires this year. The library currently levies 0.97 mil due to the headling limit. If we want to ask for the restoration of the 1.5 mils, do we need one or two questions? In this example, you need two questions because the renewal is 0.97 mil, and the new millage, which we talked about before, is additional millage. Also, is any what we traditionally think of as a Headley override to get back up to the original authorized amount. Because the new millage exceeds 0.5 mil, in this example, two questions are required. So another example where you could do one question is that the library desires to ask the voters for a renewal of previously authorized millage and the amount lost through the Headley. In this example, the library wants to renew a previously authorized millage of 1 mil, but it's been reduced to 0.9. You can ask for 0.9 mils as renewal and an additional 0.1 mil in one question since that new millage is less than 0.5 mil.
Okay, and if you have just a Headley override to an existing millage, then the Headley override would be exempted from capture. But the original millage, if it were passed before December 2016, then it would not be automatically exempt. Is that correct?
Yep. So if you had, like, let's just say you have a perpetual millage of 1 mil that was voted in and it's been captured by the DDA, and you want to go for Headley override and it's 0.1 mil, the 0.1 mil won't be subject to capture, but the 0.9 will still be subject to capture. As long as there's other, I don't want to get into big millage exemption, but there's other factors that will trigger either automatic or resolution. So be really vigilant about this. So if you have existing millages that are still captured, if all the obligations of the DDA have been paid off, that millage will become automatically exempt. That's something to talk to your lawyer about because there's definitions of what obligations are. Secondly, and I'm seeing this a lot, so be really vigilant for this. If they extend the duration of their plan, or if they expand the boundaries of the DDA district, then those are, again, opportunities for you to have your millage exempted from that. So watch out. I've seen, and I think that has to do, Claire, I don't know if you've been seeing these a lot. I think a lot of the original DDAs, there's a lot of them that were kind of developed around the same time, and they're all sort of expiring right now. And so I've been seeing that. And then, it's been maybe 20 years since the DDAs looked, and now your downtown district is expanded, and so they'll want to include more, even including one more property in the DDA will trigger that, but it requires a resolution of the board. It's not an automatic exemption. The expansion of the DDA and the expansion of the district itself or the duration of the plan both require a resolution within 60 days of the public hearing. They should send you a notice of public hearing. Anytime you get a notice of public hearing on DDA issue, I recommend that you pay close attention to that. Maybe ship it out to your lawyer to see if there's any opportunities. Again, because you might love the DDA. The library might be in the DDA district. Maybe they just spent thousands and thousands of dollars beautifying the front of the library or the street. And so there may be reasons why you want to continue that. you may want to opt out and then also enter into an agreement that gives you some more flexibility. And then, because you really, it's sometimes it's a once in a 3 decades opportunity to opt out. You can't really get back again. So something to seriously consider. I don't want to hijack this discussion with that, but I do want to point it out if you're getting, because some libraries are getting significant amount of money captured by the DDA. Significant. Some of it's, some of it's minor. I've had clients that it's really not that much, and they want to, keep the peace with their municipality. I would still consider opting out and then entering an agreement, even if it's a year-by-year agreement. Again, because it puts the library and really in the driver's seat on that instead of the DDA. All right, back to ballot language. Let's see. I think I want to make sure that we did talk about this. Okay. So you have to adopt a resolution to place the millage on the ballot. You can have 2 millage elections within 1 calendar year. District libraries, that's easy. You're fully in control of when those are. But with townships or villages or cities, you have to be a little bit careful because let's just say the township put a ballot on they put election on this in February. They probably only have one other shot, either in August or November to put ballots on, and so you want to make sure that your library millage will not be excluded because the township's gone too many times in a calendar year to voters on millage proposals. So I haven't actually seen this happen, Claire. Maybe I might have actually seen this happen to a library to get excluded, but it's really important to, as part of your planning process, to really be careful of that. All right, election dates. Ballot proposals must be certified by the county clerk 70 days before the election. The State Elections Bureau now puts out a very handy elections calendar with the deadline in there. The one thing I have to say is and so you think it's probably error-free as far as when the deadline is, but there's 2 deadlines that are cited, and they occur within 2 weeks of each other. One is a petition to place a ballot proposal on, and the other is just a ballot proposal deadline. Unless you're forming a new township library, or unless you are amending a district library through the petitioning process, that earlier deadline doesn't apply to you. So I just actually twice this, I guess this millage season, I've seen county clerks cite the wrong date to the client because they cite the petition date, which is an earlier date than the actual date. So, because it's the earlier date, really, there's not harm, but sometimes the libraries are like, well, I'm going to have a special meeting because my regular meeting falls after that deadline. So knowing that deadline is really important, just because it might make your life easier as far as having to have a special deadline. Yeah, and at May 14th and November 5th is August 13th, and it's at 4 o'clock, as I recall, right? And so you want to make sure that the board approves that resolution and submits it to the county before that deadline. Okay. Let's see, how can you find out if units of government in our library district are capturing funds they should not be taking? I would reach out to, would it be county equalization or county treasurer, Claire, that would have that? You could reach out to the municipality itself, but typically if you want like a one-stop shop, it would be the county treasurer.
There's also, I just found out that part of the legislation requires all of the authorities to post a report every year that lists how much they take, what millages they take from, what they use the money on. And a spot check showed that some do it better than others. But then they have to send that same information to Treasury. And then every year, Treasury compiles that information and gives it to the legislature. So I reached out to Treasury and I got a copy of the one that's in process for this year. So it doesn't list everybody yet, but it does list every county, every millage, including public libraries. It lists schools, it lists individual municipalities, and it tells you how much they take. And I'll send you what I have, Anne, so that you could see it. It's just not complete. So I've asked for a copy. They're waiting for all of the uh, authorities to submit their information. So I've asked them if when it's done, if I can get a copy, and then I'll make that available. But it's pretty shocking when you see the amount of money that's been taken out.
Yeah, it really affects villages and some, revenue. And so again, it's all part of the sort of your idea of what you want to do with that millage if you are lucky enough to be able to exempt it. So I would always encourage you to verify with your county clerk. I just hate the idea that you thinking one day, they're thinking the other, and usually it's really easy to clear up, but I'd like to avoid all those types of issues.
Mhm.
So marketing the millage, I'm just really going to hit this from a pure legal perspective because I think Shirley's coming up next week to talk to you about other aspects of marketing the millage. But one of the things to really keep in mind is the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, and the Michigan Campaign Finance Act regulates how public money can be spent with an election. And my number one thing to point out is that if you're preparing material to go out to voters, I would have that material reviewed by your attorney before you send it out. And I say that with I've had, and I do, and this is true even if you have marketing professionals prepare that material for you. You don't assume the marketing professional knows the Michigan Campaign Finance Act, and their motivation and is really it's often aligned with the library's motivation is to have good marketing with that millage. Problem is sometimes it butts heads a little bit with what you legally can do. And I've just had some situations over the years where libraries have paid a ton of money to get marketing materials done, and then they've been redlined by us. And so it's frustrating. I get it. It's because of the Michigan Campaign Finance Act. Sometimes the stuff that you can actually tell voters is boring, and it's not like the flashy stuff. The flashy stuff will get you in trouble with the Michigan Campaign Finance Act. But there's other things you can do, and we can talk about that in a minute, as far as what the library can and can't do. But just these are the key things I like to point out in this first slide. Don't give out your patron list to any person or party to conduct a millage campaign. You can use your own patron list for your own library initiated and developed material that's in compliance with the Campaign Finance Act, but you cannot give it even to the Friends of the Library or to the Vote Yes campaign because those are technically separate entities from the library, and it would be a violation of Michigan Library Privacy Act to get that information out. Be careful how you use your meeting room and spend your money. And I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. So Section 57 of the Campaign Finance Act prohibits public funds for local ballot measures, but allows the production or dissemination of factual information concerning issues relevant to the function of the public body. It can't be promotional, persuasive, or aspirational. And I'll give you some examples based on some millage proposals or millage material that I've seen. You get anything that's backed by statistics. Certainly your circulation numbers. The amount that you put the ballot proposal in there, the amount that it will raise, the purpose of the ballot proposal. But you have to be very careful about things like, I read one that was, and it was really kind of heartbreaking for me to approach the client about it because it sounds terrible. The library said, we have the greatest staff and, world-class greatest staff. And, as much as I believe that they do have great staff, like that's more, promotional, inspirational versus and persuasive versus factual. Now, if they won the MLA's or Library of Michigan's Best Staff in Michigan award, you can put that down there, right? Those are the factual versus inspirational. Other things to consider are, we have libraries that basically will say, well, we have to shut our doors if this millage doesn't pass. Now, can you put that in the millage material? Probably not, unless the library board has taken specific action. For example, you could say, at its meeting in August, the library board voted to, drop Saturday hours because we weren't, we don't have enough money to operate on Saturdays anymore. That's actually factual. If the library board has done it, it's something you can verify by minutes. But saying something that, like, oh, if we don't get the ballot proposal passed, we're going to have to slash hours and cut staff. If the board hasn't made a decision on that yet, that's probably going to be more persuasive and promotional than factual. So those are the kinds of things, when I see a statement like that, I'm like, okay, what are you basing this statement on? Is it factual? Has the library board done something? And if the millages for a building, sometimes the approved plans will be enough to show, well, this is going to be for this building. We're going to have a courtyard. These are all the approved plans that the board's already approved. But if it's conceptual and you don't have any concrete plans yet, that's going to be a little bit more of a problem for the Campaign Finance Act. Public body employees without policymaking authority are prohibited from expressing views on behalf of the public body. So keep that in mind, that, libraries, again, want to be creative. And your constituents are typically people that come to the library. So there's a lot of, I think, groundswell to do things in the library for the campaign. And generally those should be avoided. Because if you're a library employee, even the director, you're being paid through public money. And so when you're being paid through public money and you're on the clock, quote unquote, on the clock, you are using public money for promotional. So for example, libraries will often say, well, can we, leave, our promotional ballot or promotional language was been approved, it complies with Campaign Finance Act. Can we leave it in the library at the circulation desk? Problem with that is that someone may pick it up and then start to ask one of the clerks for information. And if the information the clerk is delivering is not factual and it's vote yes, yeah, go out and vote yes, that's actually technically using public money for promoting the campaign because the clerk's being paid at the time saying vote yes to the person. And so the library can't always predict how those interactions are going to go. So sometimes my recommendation will be just to avoid that at all costs. So again, directors and salary people are a little harder. General rule of thumb is if you're scheduled to be working at the library, even if you're salaried, during working hours that you're scheduled, don't work for the campaign. Okay. If it's you go home, eat dinner, and it's instead of watching Netflix or something, you decide to make some vote yes calls. Well, technically, even though you're salaried and you're really sort of off the clock, in my opinion, in that case. So that's the kind of thing to be really clear. But again, library staff, I think, have a little bit harder job because usually, like a lot of municipalities are 9 to 5. You usually see this, the village office open on a Saturday, all the time. And so it's a little easier to make those time differentials, but libraries, with your hours and stuff, it's a little bit harder, but just be pretty conservative about it. And because public bodies are prohibited from using public funds to promote campaigns, any lawn signs, brochures, and buttons telling the public to vote yes or vote for the library may not be purchased with public funds. Public funds are also not limited to tax revenue, even gifts or donations made to the public library. I get this question a lot, can someone donate $500 to the library and then can we use that? The answer is no, because once it hits the coffers of the library, it becomes public funds. So it's no different than your tax funds because the law doesn't just say tax funds. It's all types of revenue for the library that become public funds. That's what you can't use. Also watch out for your meeting rooms under the Michigan Finance Act. The use of a public facility by a committee promoting an election may be prevented if other candidates and committees have equal opportunity. My rule of thumb is don't let the vote yes people do something that you wouldn't let the vote no people do. So for example, if your meeting room policy is that you can only meet twice a month in the meeting room and you allow the vote yes committee to meet every week, so 4 times a month. And then when the vote no committee comes in and says, I want to meet 4 times a month, you say, no, our policy says only twice a month. It's that kind of stuff that's going to be a violation of the Campaign Finance Act, even if specific money hasn't traded hands. Um, and I think it's natural that the director typically, has more time to work with the vote yes committee. But be careful about requests for information from the vote yes committee that you wouldn't also do for the vote no committee. And I think Shirley's going to probably get into a little bit into she's going to get exactly into the ballot question committee stuff. I do want to make just a legal distinction, just so you know, like ballot question committee. So if you're going to spend over $500 in promotion of the campaign, you have to form a ballot question committee. There's lots of legal reporting requirements. So the rule of thumb is to have a good treasurer for your ballot question committee. The ballot question committee is a separate entity. It's separate from the library. It's also separate from the Friends of the Library. So you might have the board of directors of the Friends of the Library form a ballot question committee, but that's still going to be a separate entity from that Friends of the Library. And I do make a caution of that because I don't typically get in, because I represent the library in most cases, I don't get into the ins and outs of it, but typically library, 501c3s or nonprofits are limited as to what they can donate to a ballot question committee. So you might get a lot of those questions coming your way. And again, as a public entity, that's really not something you should be weighing in on as much as you might want to, but be careful of that. That's probably something that, having somebody like Shirley, who's a, volunteer to help with the committee, can kind of look into. And I don't know if Library Michigan has this on their site, but the Department of Bureau of Elections has great information on ballot question committees, how to form them. I think it's actually very user friendly. Is that linked to your pages at all, Claire? Okay.
No, I just put the link on the chat to the ballot question committee stuff at the Department of State.
It's really good information. So first step is to really direct the people that are doing the ballot question committee to the state adopted information. I think that's a really good starting point. And then, sometimes we just have to tell them, look, you got to really hire your own attorney because the library really can't spend its public money helping you set up a ballot question committee and answer your questions about how much the Friends can donate to the ballot question committee. So those are the types of things that it's a little awkward because they're helping you. They're there to support your millage. And, but I think, understanding the limits of the Campaign Finance Act, being able to convey that to the Friends and to the ballot question committee is important so that they understand that your hands are tied, that, obviously if you would, you could, but you can't. So, you don't want to get into problems with the ballot question committee. There's 3 laws, FOIA, Open Meetings Act, and Michigan Campaign Finance Act, that I think if you're accused of violating and it gets out in the paper, there's always this like feeling that they're doing something shady or doing something wrong. You're trying to hide something from the public. And so even if it's unfounded, even if it's unintentional, I think to avoid campaign finance from a marketing perspective for your millage, avoiding campaign finance issues is really important as well. So that's it. Claire, is there anything I missed?
No, I think you got it. There's a question in the list. I have policy making authority. Can I say vote for the library?
I think I'd have to look at that. Is it a director? Is it a director or a board
A
member?
director. Yeah, I believe.
I think I'll have to look at this because I don't know if there's a debate. Did we already decide that, Claire, whether directors have policy making authority from a campaign finance perspective?
I don't think we've talked about that.
Yeah, that's
That's,
one I don't know. I think I'll have to investigate.
yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'll have to go look at that.
I think your board can probably delegate you some policy making authority, but the issue is whether it's policy making authority from the perspective of the Campaign Finance Act. So I'm not 100% sure you can do that. And I would just be careful too of that while you're at the library. But
and that's for if like you're speaking at Rotary or something, right? You can't, it's not so that you cross the desk. You can say to the public. Yeah. And then it looks like there's another question on the bottom. Yes, the ballot question committee is the yes committee. Oh, he says he's the president of the board who asked that question. Thank you, Gary.
You can. But
Then
again,
you can.
you got to be careful though, because some of this overlaps, and I think Claire kind of got to that a little bit. That's usually that, like, you can do an op-ed piece and put the fact that you're the
Mhm.
board president instead of just, a citizen. You can, you know, even I think make a statement probably at a public meeting. I mean, but you have to be careful. I don't think that gives you the right to then, um, come to, I wouldn't still
Yeah.
come to the library and use that public space to do that. I think that's kind of
Yeah. Um,
ridiculous.
and what about board members of the library being on the ballot question committee?
It's not prohibited. You just have to be very careful because you want to make sure that you're wearing two hats there, that you're not doing something that, unintentionally doing something. And by that I mean, there's been instances where, I think that as a board member, that maybe the staff gives you deference and will, so if you walk in the library and you're president of the board and you hand something to the staff and said, I need 50 copies of this, staff's probably gonna do it and won't really think about it. But if that's because they're thinking, well, he's the president of the board, he's asking me to do something, of course I'm going to do it. But if you're wearing your ballot question committee hat, then you're walking to the library and asking them to give you copies that you would normally charge somebody else for. So that's the kind of stuff you have to just be really careful about.
Can you be like I usually dissuade people from being like on the commit like on the an officer for the
Yeah,
ballot question committee if they're a board member. But I don't know what your perspective on that is.
I definitely, I definitely um, recommend that not happen. I think there's just too it's the appearance of it. Particularly, I think if it's a challenging election or if you get a lot of opposition to the millage, I think it just breeds more basis.
Mhm. Okay, there's one more question. If you need to do two questions, a renewal and a new amount, do both of those count against the, oh, sorry, it's blocking, against the two millage elections in the same year?
Okay, so I want to clarify. The two elections is not the number of proposals; it's the times of the year that you go for the election. So I'm assuming the question is going for two questions at one election, that only counts as one. But if you went for the renewal in May and you're going for the new millage in August, then yes, that's two elections. But if you're going for both the renewal and the millage, even though they're two questions on the same August ballot, that's only one election. That's a good question.
Well, that's all the questions in the chat. We still have a little bit of time. Does anybody have any other question they want to add? You can unmute. You can put it in the chat.
Put it a hand up.
Anybody?
Hi, I have a
Oh,
question. I have
hello.
many questions, as you can see.
That's okay.
Um, um, I'm struggling to get a yes committee off the ground. Is a yes committee required, or can you go for a millage strictly with an information campaign?
That's is never required. You can
It's
always,
required for that type of yes campaigning and
yeah.
signs and promo.
There's
But
there's no requirement at all that you market the millage. You could just pass a resolution, put it on the ballot, and not say a word to anybody, and that's fine. But typically, the library wants to provide some information. I see a lot of it, and that's one of the things to go back to, kind of like, what if your millages are passing historically by 90%, and you are in a jurisdiction where all millages are passing by 90%. It might not be with your time and money to put a vote yes campaign together. But if your last millage, if millages are going down in flames in your jurisdiction and your last millage passed by 5 votes, you're probably going to want to do a ballot question.
yeah, mine have been passing, millages across the board have been passing in my area and around the 70% marker.
And just be
But I
careful.
also have a friends group who are going through rebranding, we'll say. And a lot of my library advocates are actually members outside of the district. So I'm with my new capacity, I'm struggling to find and identify people that would want to serve on a yes committee within the district.
Well, and just be careful about, what you do on library time
Mhm.
and library money.
Um, this is one that I have not found clarity on. The amount of money it takes to get onto the ballot, is that who pays for that?
Well, if you're talking about, are you talking about like preparing the ballot language?
Not necessarily preparing the ballot language, but getting it on the ballot. I've been told that there's a fee to do that by my clerk, like election fee.
Oh, so, so libraries, and I actually have seen this a lot more in the last like 5 years, that there, a lot more counties are requiring all the people on the ballot to chip in for the cost of the election. Is that it?
I think so. And that's why I'm using that as trying to figure out how long we want to go for in case we want to try to line up and make sure that there's other elections happening. Our county roads commission just did this last year where they had to pay the entire election themselves because they were the only thing on the ballot.
Yeah, so those costs can all be paid. That's not, that can be all paid by the library.
Okay, I was trying to find clarification anywhere on that, but all I was is like, here's the yes campaign stuff, and I'm like, okay, but what about the election just getting on?
Yeah, so that you can pay, like libraries can pay to have,
The
like
lawyer, looking over the materials.
you could pay for, if you have to have a special meeting and pay your board members, that can all come out of the library's funds. There's no application fee or any upfront fee to get on the election, but in the end, that you might get a bill for your portion of the election costs, and that, again, that can also be paid for public money.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Anne, there's a new question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
Let's see, if library, if the library has a millage on the ballot. Runs a big summer reading campaign and a lawn signs given out. A library meeting this year. Yeah, I don't see that as a violation of campaign finance. Do you? Yeah.
No, not if they're giving it out as part of summer reading.
Yeah. It also doesn't, it doesn't direct them to vote in any sort of way.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Anybody else?
I have another one. I'm so sorry. I, as the director, also work as an election official. Should I exempt myself from that election? Where I am election official is not in the library district, so the library would not be on the ballot that I would be servicing.
I don't, I don't think that's a problem.
But if I were to also live in the same district, like I work in the district where the ballot question would be on a ballot.
I, I don't know the legal answer to that,
Okay.
but I would not participate as an election official where you have a direct interest in.
I figured as much, but
I don't know.
for the record.
Stuff, I can't tell you whether it's a specific legal, I've never been asked that, so I actually don't know whether that's a direct legal conflict. I just think it's asking.
I mean, I don't know any director that would want to both work the election and then stay up half the night figuring out if their millage passed, but I figured I'd ask.
I avoid that at all costs. Hey, and maybe that's the reason why you can get a good night's sleep and not have to stay up all night. It's a commendable role, and election officials, I think, have to. But I just think I would avoid that with your own millage at issue.
Thank you.
And I would probably disclose to whoever I would disclose to whoever you're serving as an election official too, just that you work for a public library, just so that they know. And I don't think they'll have a problem with it, but I don't think it hurts to disclose that to the whoever's election. All right.
Anything else? I don't see anything else in the chat. Anybody else have anything? We have just a few minutes left.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity for my room spin to speak to all of you.
Thank
So
you, Anne.
it's good. All right.
Thank you, Anne, so much. We appreciate it very much.
All right. Bye.
Okay, bye, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.